I'd barely unpacked the car after my youngest daughter's wedding weekend when I noticed something that made my stomach drop before I even stepped onto the porch. The afternoon sun was pouring across my backyard in a way I'd never seen before. It felt wrong. Too bright, too empty. And then I looked past the fence and my heart just sank. The three massive white oaks that had shaded my property for longer than anyone in my family had been alive were simply gone. Not trimmed, not damaged by a storm, not struck by lightning, just gone, replaced by three ugly stumps surrounded by fresh sawdust, crushed wildflowers, shredded nests, and deep tire tracks that looked like someone had driven an army through my garden. For a second, I honestly wondered if I'd pulled into the wrong driveway, because the yard I'd spent 30 years caring for looked like a crime scene. Those trees weren't decorations. They had been planted sometime around the turn of the 20th century by the original owners of the farmhouse. My grandfather used to tell me stories about climbing them during the Great Depression. My kids built swings from their branches. My late wife insisted every family photo be taken beneath them every Thanksgiving. And now all that history had been erased over one weekend, while I was away celebrating something that was supposed to be one of the happiest moments of our family's life. I didn't have to guess who did it. My neighbor, Vanessa Cole, had been obsessed with those trees ever since she bought the property next door 2 years earlier. Vanessa was one of those luxury lifestyle influencers who somehow became wealthy, convincing strangers that happiness came with imported stone patios, infinity edge pools, and kitchens bigger than most apartments. She bulldozed a charming brick colonial to build what she proudly called a modern architectural statement, though everyone else in town called it a glass shoebox that looked completely out of place. Everything about her house screamed expensive: steel beams, giant windows, designer lighting, manicured hedges trimmed into perfect cubes, and a backyard that looked more like a boutique resort than a family home. The only thing she couldn't buy was the panoramic valley view she kept bragging about online, because my oak trees stood right between her pool deck and the sunset. At first she tried being polite, showing up with expensive pastries and smiling like we were old friends. "Elliot," she'd say, "have you ever considered thinning those trees? They're beautiful, but they really block the scenery." I'd smile and tell her they weren't going anywhere. A few weeks later, she offered to pay for professional maintenance, claiming she knew the best arborists in the county. Then the offers became suggestions, the suggestions became complaints, and the complaints slowly turned into veiled threats wrapped inside fake concern. She claimed falling branches could damage her property, that the shade made her pool colder, that leaves kept blowing into her expensive filtration system. Every conversation somehow ended with those trees. I explained over and over that they were part of the character of the neighborhood, older than every house on our street except mine, and that I had no interest in cutting them down just because someone wanted prettier pictures for social media. She'd force a smile every time, but her eyes always gave away the frustration. Looking back, I should have recognized that look. It wasn't disappointment, it was calculation. I marched straight across the property line without even taking off my jacket. Vanessa was stretched out beside her sparkling infinity pool, wearing oversized sunglasses, sipping something that looked far more expensive than my monthly electric bill. She saw me coming, lowered the glasses just enough to recognize who I was, and instead of looking nervous, she smiled. "Well," she said casually, "I guess you've noticed the improvement." I stared at her, trying to process how someone could sound so proud after destroying something that wasn't theirs. "You cut down my trees." She shrugged. "Those old things. My consultant determined they were hazardous. Honestly, I probably saved your insurance company a headache." I asked what consultant she was talking about. She waved toward a folder sitting on the outdoor table. Certified arborist, emergency assessment, everything was documented. She actually sounded annoyed that I wasn't thanking her. "Those trees were unhealthy, Elliot. You should appreciate that someone finally handled the problem." I picked up the paperwork. The inspection had supposedly happened 3 days earlier while I was hundreds of miles away, and somehow every recommendation conveniently concluded with immediate removal. The signatures looked rushed, the photographs barely showed the trunks, and the report claimed structural decay I'd never seen despite having the trees professionally inspected just 8 months earlier. I told her she had no authority to touch anything on my property. She leaned back in her chair without the slightest hint of guilt. "Relax," she laughed. "Lawyers handled all of it. If you have questions, call them." That smug little smile stayed on her face the entire time, like she'd already won before the game even started. I called the city forestry office the second I got back inside. They confirmed emergency paperwork had indeed been submitted late Friday afternoon, approved under expedited review because the filing claimed immediate public safety concerns. The woman on the phone sounded sympathetic, but she warned me any formal challenge would likely take weeks. Weeks, while my 100-year-old trees were already reduced to mulch. I sat in my garage surrounded by old family boxes, trying to calm myself down, when I noticed a dusty binder labeled Hillside Ecological Survey. My Aunt Margaret had been an environmental scientist for decades. And years before she passed away, she'd spent half her career documenting native ecosystems throughout our county. I opened the binder mostly looking for comfort, maybe an old photograph of the property before everything changed. Instead, tucked between yellowed maps and handwritten field notes, I found a series of conservation records I'd completely forgotten existed: detailed habitat studies, protected species inventories, environmental easements, and correspondence between federal wildlife officials dating back almost 50 years. As I flipped through those pages, one sentence stopped me cold, and for the first time since seeing those empty stumps, I realized Vanessa hadn't simply destroyed 3 old trees. She may have just triggered consequences far bigger than she could possibly imagine. Before I jump back into what happened next, let me point something out, because this is where a lot of people misunderstand how these situations work. According to standard procedure, an emergency permit is supposed to be used only when there's a genuine and immediate safety risk, not because someone wants a prettier backyard view. From a legal perspective, property disputes often become much bigger the moment environmental protections, conservation easements, or protected habitats enter the picture, because local approvals don't automatically override state or federal regulations. This is a psychological trap. People with money and confidence sometimes believe that if they move fast enough, hire enough experts, and bury everyone under paperwork, they'll create the illusion that their actions can't be reversed. Most neighbors give up because fighting back feels too expensive and too exhausting. But paperwork cuts both ways. Every permit creates a record, every signature leaves a trail, and every shortcut eventually has to survive real scrutiny. The lesson here is, never assume the first piece of paper someone waves in your face is the final word, because sometimes the strongest protection isn't the loudest argument. It's the law nobody bothered to read until it was too late. I stayed up almost the entire night surrounded by my Aunt Margaret's old research boxes, and the more I read, the more my anger slowly transformed into something much more dangerous: certainty. She hadn't just collected notes about native plants. She'd spent decades documenting every significant ecological feature on our hillside, every migration pattern, every nesting season, every protected species that depended on those old trees. There were aerial photographs dating back to the 70s, hand-drawn habitat maps, letters exchanged with conservation agencies, and one thick folder containing the original environmental agreements that had been recorded long before Vanessa or I ever owned our properties. Those 3 white oaks weren't simply old trees. They formed part of a designated habitat corridor connecting 2 preserved woodland sections outside the city. Remove them, and you weren't just changing landscaping. You were disrupting an entire protected ecosystem. Suddenly, every arrogant word Vanessa had thrown at me beside her pool echoed differently in my head. She thought she'd outsmarted a stubborn neighbor. In reality, she'd stepped into a legal mess that operated on a completely different level. By sunrise, I'd scanned every document, photographed every stump from multiple angles, collected pieces of freshly cut wood, recorded damaged bird nests scattered across my yard, and even located family photographs showing those same trees standing healthy through every season over the past 20 years. Then I started making phone calls. Not to another private attorney. This time I contacted agencies that didn't care how expensive someone's house was or how influential their lawyer claimed to be. Within 48 hours, the first government vehicles rolled into our neighborhood. They weren't flashy police cruisers or television news vans. They were plain white SUVs with official seals on the doors, carrying environmental investigators, wildlife biologists, survey specialists, and compliance officers. Our quiet street suddenly looked like the scene of a major infrastructure inspection. Curtains started moving all over the neighborhood as people peeked through their windows, trying to figure out why federal employees were walking across both properties carrying clipboards, GPS equipment, measuring wheels, and cameras. Vanessa walked outside wearing another perfectly tailored outfit and that same practiced smile she used whenever cameras were nearby. "Can I help you?" she asked one of the investigators. He politely introduced himself, showed his identification, and explained they were conducting an environmental compliance review concerning recent vegetation removal. I wish I could tell you her confidence disappeared instantly, but it didn't. She actually laughed. "Oh, that's already been handled," she said. "We had emergency authorization." The investigator simply nodded and replied, "That's one of the documents we're reviewing." Then he kept walking without another word. That tiny exchange lasted maybe 20 seconds, but for the first time I saw uncertainty cross her face. By the second day, the inspection expanded beyond the missing trees. Surveyors began measuring setbacks around her pool. Biologists inspected the hillside behind her retaining wall. Soil specialists took samples from disturbed ground where heavy equipment had been operating for months. One official spent nearly an hour comparing old satellite imagery with current drone photographs. It turned out removing the trees had opened the door to examining everything else connected to the renovation, and that's where the real problems started surfacing. The imported decorative landscaping had replaced protected native vegetation without proper environmental review. Several drainage modifications redirected stormwater towards sensitive slopes. Portions of the retaining wall extended into a restricted buffer zone. Even the excavation for her luxury pool had disturbed root systems extending well beyond her property line. Every new discovery led investigators to another question, another inspection, another document request. By Friday afternoon, 3 separate agencies were coordinating their findings. Vanessa's expensive legal team finally showed up, briefcases in hand, speaking confidently into phones and assuring her the situation was under control. I overheard one attorney say, "This is just administrative." Another promised everything could be resolved through clarification. But documents don't negotiate with confidence, and facts don't disappear because someone bills $800 an hour. A week later, I received a request to attend an official site meeting. Representatives from multiple departments gathered around folding tables set up beneath a temporary canopy overlooking both properties. Maps covered every surface. Colored lines marked habitat boundaries I'd never even realized existed. One biologist explained that cavity-nesting birds had historically used my trees during breeding season. Another pointed out that the mature root systems stabilized portions of the hillside, reducing erosion after heavy rains. An environmental planner described how decades of conservation planning relied on preserving those exact canopy connections. Listening to them, I realized those trees had quietly been doing jobs none of us ever noticed until they were gone. Vanessa arrived halfway through the meeting wearing designer sunglasses despite the cloudy morning. Her attorney immediately objected to nearly every conclusion presented. He insisted the emergency arborist report justified immediate removal. One investigator calmly slid another folder across the table. "We've reviewed that report," he said. "Several findings conflict with independent examinations conducted before removal." Another official added that the emergency photographs submitted with the permit application appeared inconsistent with the actual condition of the trees documented in prior municipal records. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody argued dramatically. They simply kept placing evidence on the table, one document after another, until the room became painfully quiet. Then came the conversation that completely changed everything. The lead environmental officer explained that because federally protected habitat had potentially been damaged, the investigation no longer focused solely on the trees themselves. It now included every construction activity that may have contributed to habitat degradation during the previous 2 years. Vanessa interrupted, saying, "You're telling me my entire backyard project is under investigation because of 3 trees? The officer answered without emotion, "No, ma'am. We're saying the removal of those trees required us to evaluate the entire environmental impact associated with the property improvements." I honestly think that was the first moment she understood how serious the situation had become. Over the following month, contractors stopped showing up at her house. Bright compliance notices appeared near sections of the property under review. More survey crews visited. Engineers inspected drainage systems. Wildlife specialists documented replacement habitat requirements. Reporters even began calling the city after public records requests revealed an ongoing environmental enforcement case involving one of the county's most expensive residential renovations. Vanessa stopped posting glamorous backyard photos online. The infinity pool that had once appeared in nearly every video suddenly disappeared from her social media accounts. Then the official orders finally arrived. She was required to fund extensive ecological restoration across the affected portions of the property. Unauthorized landscaping had to be removed. Native vegetation had to be replanted according to approved restoration plans. Continuous environmental monitoring would remain in place for years. Most significantly, substantial portions of the luxury backyard improvements, including sections surrounding the pool, could not remain in their existing configuration because they conflicted with the required habitat restoration. Watching demolition equipment return was one of the strangest experiences of my life. Months earlier, similar machines had crossed onto my property to destroy something irreplaceable. Now heavy equipment rolled into Vanessa's backyard under government supervision, not to build something extravagant, but to dismantle expensive improvements that had become incompatible with the restoration requirements. Concrete disappeared. Decorative stone came out. Exotic plants were loaded into trucks. Workers carefully removed features that had probably cost hundreds of thousands of dollars to install. I didn't celebrate. Honestly, I just stood quietly on my porch with a cup of coffee, thinking about how differently all of this could have ended if she'd simply accepted that not every view belongs to the person willing to pay the most for it. My 3-century-old oaks were still gone, and no legal victory could change that. But something else happened that surprised me. Restoration specialists invited me to participate in developing a long-term recovery plan for my property. They discussed heritage tree replacement, native understory restoration, erosion control, and wildlife habitat improvements designed to benefit the entire hillside instead of just one yard. For the first time since coming home from my daughter's wedding, I felt like something meaningful might actually grow out of all this loss. Vanessa had spent years trying to reshape the landscape around her dream house, but in the end, the landscape and the law protecting it reshaped her future instead. A few months later, the neighborhood looked different, not because someone had built something bigger or more expensive, but because people had started paying attention to things they used to walk past without a second thought. Kids stopped asking why there were survey flags scattered across the hillside and started asking why those tiny saplings had protective cages around them. The restoration crews explained that every young tree represented a promise to the future, not a replacement for the past. My original white oaks would never come back in my lifetime, and I eventually accepted that. You don't replace a century with a receipt or a settlement check. You honor it by making sure the next generation has something worth protecting. The restoration program helped replant native species throughout my property, stabilize the soil, and improve wildlife habitat in ways I never could have afforded on my own. Every spring after that, I noticed more birds returning, more butterflies drifting through the yard, and little by little the silence left with the seasons. It wasn't the same landscape I grew up with, but it was alive again, and somehow that mattered more than trying to recreate what had already been lost. As for Vanessa, word traveled quickly in real estate circles. Prospective buyers loved the house until they learned about the ongoing environmental oversight, the restoration obligations, and the restrictions attached to the property. Suddenly, that luxury backyard everyone once admired became a permanent reminder that expensive mistakes don't disappear just because they're landscaped nicely. She eventually sold the place for far less than she'd invested and moved into a downtown high-rise where, ironically enough, the only trees she could complain about were the ones planted along the sidewalk several stories below. I never spoke to her again, and honestly, I didn't need to. There wasn't anything left to say. The outcome had already said everything. Looking back now, I realize I almost made the same mistake she did, just in a different way. I wanted revenge because I was angry, and believe me, I had every reason to be. But anger burns fast, while patience has a funny habit of uncovering things emotion never sees. According to standard procedure, every dispute should begin with facts instead of assumptions, documentation instead of shouting, and evidence instead of emotion. That doesn't sound very exciting, but it's usually how lasting victories are built. From a legal perspective, Ownership comes with rights, but it also comes with responsibilities, especially when your property affects neighboring land, protected resources, or the community around you. People often think money creates exceptions, when more often it simply creates a larger paper trail for investigators to follow. This is a psychological trap. Confidence can slowly become arrogance, and arrogance convinces people that consequences are only for someone else. Once a person starts believing they're too important to hear the word no, they usually stop asking whether they should do something and only focus on whether they can get away with it. That's where the biggest mistakes are made. The lesson here is, respect isn't measured by how much land you own or how impressive your backyard looks. It's measured by how carefully you treat things that don't belong solely to you, whether that's a shared neighborhood, a piece of local history, or a tree that took generations to become what it is today. Every time I sit on my porch now with a cup of coffee, I still catch myself glancing toward the place where those old giants once stood. I miss them, and I probably always will. But I also see young trees reaching upward, neighbors slowing down to admire them, and children asking questions about why they matter. Maybe that's the real ending to this story. Not that someone lost a fortune, or that expensive landscaping had to be removed, but that an entire community remembered some things are valuable precisely because they can't be replaced once they're gone. So now I'm curious what you think. If you came home and discovered someone had destroyed something on your property that had been part of your family's history for generations, would you have fought the way I did, or would you have walked away and tried to move on? Let me know down in the comments because I genuinely like to hear how other people see it. And if you enjoyed stories where patience, preparation, and accountability matter more than shouting matches, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stick around, because sometimes the quietest victories leave the biggest mark.